A number of writers have recently spoken about psychiatry going through a crisis at the moment. One prominent United States psychiatrist, Ronald Pease, in a recent article pointed out that if you Google the phrase "psychiatry is in trouble," you'll get over 2,000 hits. Now, there are various versions of what this crisis is about, but it is clear that patients, the public, commentators, and even a growing number of psychiatrists themselves are losing faith in the models and the treatments that have been developed and promoted over the past quarter of a century. In the past few years, the efficacy, that is the benefits, and the safety of antidepressant drugs and antipsychotic drugs has come under intense scrutiny. Figures now coming from various parts of the world indicate that people with long-term, what we call serious mental health problems on antipsychotic drugs are living 20 years less than the rest of the general population. And some of the blame for that decreased mortality is being placed at the hands of the increasing use of antipsychotic drugs. And certainly in the English language medical journals, there have been editorials and discussions highlighting the downside of these medications. And then there's an increasing concern with the massive expansion in use of psychiatric drugs in recent years. In addition, the legitimacy of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, which I'm sure you'll have heard about here in Denmark, because everywhere else in the world has heard of this, even though it is an American production. It has now come to frame debates about mental illness all around the world. And the 5th edition of this is being produced, but it is coming under increased attack, not least from the person who was the chief organizer and writer of the 4th version of the DSM. Alan Francis has very publicly criticized the assumptions and the models and the ideas that are going into the 5th version. There are growing concerns that more and more aspects of human life are being described and framed in medical terms. At the same time, some psychiatrists have started to question whether medical research has made any great contribution to the lives of people with mental health problems. They've started to ask whether research in genetics, in neuroscience, and neuroimaging has made any worthwhile contribution to patient care. In spite of all the millions of dollars and pounds, and I'm sure krona, that have been spent on this research, the question is starting to be asked, what has it actually delivered to ordinary patients in their struggles with mental illness? In addition, psychiatry as a profession has been rocked by revelations about financial links between senior academics and the pharmaceutical industry, particularly in the United States. It has emerged that some of the main spokespeople for the American Psychiatric Association and senior academics within universities like Harvard and elsewhere have actually been receiving thousands of dollars from the pharmaceutical industry for their support for the development of drugs, etc. At the same time, we have witnessed the growth of the international service user movement. I don't know what the equivalent phrase in Denmark is. There's a lot of debate in English language circles about what is the best way of speaking. Do we talk about patients, or service users, or consumers, or even survivors of the mental health system? So there's a lot of debate there. In this lecture, I will just use the term service user, but I'm aware that there is a lot of concern. But we will talk about a service user movement. This is now well established and is not going away. In the UK alone, in the United Kingdom, it is now estimated that there are at least 300 different groups with an approximate membership of over 9,000 people. These are active people in the service user movement. This movement is now worldwide. There are patient organizations in Africa, in Asia, in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the United States, here in Denmark, everywhere. And it is now consulted by national governments, the WHO, the United Nations, and even more recently, the World Psychiatric Association has started to meet with service user organizations like Mind Freedom International. Had a big meeting with the World Psychiatric Association within the last couple of years. Now, while some service users and their organizations are happy to define themselves and their problems through the language of psychiatry and psychopathology, many are not. Such groups and such individuals hold a variety of views. There isn't a single voice from within the service user movement, but they are united in general by a rejection of the traditional psychiatric view on way of framing their problems and intervening in their lives. So these questions, these revelations, these movements have come together to create what I believe is genuinely, what I have put on the top of this slide, a crisis of legitimacy for psychiatry. In this lecture, I will argue that the root cause of this crisis goes deep. It is not just because of the pharmaceutical industry or a few corrupt psychiatrists. It's not because of a few mistakes with the DSM or whatever, that more research would get it right, or changing a few aspects of the system will get it right. I'm going to argue that the root cause of this crisis is the dominant paradigm, the dominant framework, the dominant assumptions that lie deep within psychiatry itself and which guide its theories and its practices. I will argue that psychiatry is very much a product of the Enlightenment. As such, it is very much a modernist movement. What do I mean by that? I mean, essentially, it involves a quest to frame all human problems in a scientific and technical idiom. The underlying paradigm that has shaped and guided psychiatry since its origins is thus a technological one. Psychiatry sees its job as a scientific endeavor to frame the problems that it comes across in a technical way and to intervene in a scientific and technical way to solve those problems. That is what I mean by it having a modernist agenda. The postmodern thought that I support, and where the concept of post-psychiatry ultimately draws its inspiration from, is not about a rejection of the Enlightenment. It is more about understanding its limitations, realizing its dangers, and learning to live with an acceptance that some human problems will not be cracked, will not be solved by more science and more technology. I will argue that the realm of mental health is one area of human life that cannot be grasped in a purely technical way. And I will go on to argue that we should be seeking not a new model or a new paradigm, but the imagination to think what a post-technological or post-psychiatry would look like. That's basically where I'm going with this. My understanding of the Enlightenment and its relationship to psychiatry is largely influenced by the work of a British medical historian by the name of Roy Porter. Tragically, Roy Porter died of a heart attack within the last few years in his early 60s. He was a very active writer. He made a huge contribution to intellectual life in Britain, and his loss is a major blow to us. His historical work in the area of the Enlightenment is authoritative. He was the major professor of the history of medicine in London, and his work was acknowledged by the Royal College of Psychiatry, who made him an honorary fellow before he died of their organization. His work was centered on the history of the Enlightenment, but he had a particular interest in the history of madness. He wrote a book on the social history of madness, but also about the history of medicine. And he's written. He was an incredibly productive academic who produced many books in this area. Porter wrote about the Enlightenment, but was particularly interested, as I say, in the social history of madness and the emergence of psychiatry in the 19th century. Very briefly, the Enlightenment was that great cultural shift beginning in the 17th century that reorientated European thought and culture away from a focus on religion and towards reason. For the thinkers of the Enlightenment, truth was no longer to be found through religious revelation, through reading the Bible or the holy books. Truth was to be found by using our human reason and rationality. This was a brave move for the Enlightenment thinkers in a world that was still dominated by kings and cardinals and popes, etc. In a famous essay, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote, "Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without the guidance of another. This immaturity is called self-incurred if its cause is not lack of understanding, but lack of resolution and courage to use it without the guidance of another." The motto of the Enlightenment is therefore sapere aude, have courage to use your own understanding. In the world that emerged after the Enlightenment, human understanding was to be prized above everything else. Rationality, reason, was to be the most important human attribute. People were to be judged by this and this alone. According to Roy Porter, this gave rise to a whole social movement aimed at getting rid of irrational people, the unreasonable and the mad. Porter writes, he says, "The enterprise of the Age of Reason, gaining authority from the mid-17th century onwards, was to criticize, condemn, and crush whatever its protagonists considered to be foolish or unreasonable. All beliefs and practices which appeared ignorant, primitive, childish, or useless came to be readily dismissed as idiotic or insane, evidently the products of stupid thought processes or delusion and daydream. And all that was so labelled could be deemed inimical to society or the state, indeed could be regarded as a menace to the proper workings of an orderly, efficient, progressive, rational society. This enterprise gave rise to a whole social movement that was seen right across the Western world, aimed at excluding people who were deemed to be somewhat unreasonable. The French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault famously talked about the Great Confinement. All across the Western world, huge buildings came to be constructed to house those who were excluded on account of unreason. This is our local asylum in County Cork, in Ireland, where I work. By the 20th century, this was the biggest building in Ireland. It had the longest corridor. The corridor right at the centre of this building stretched for over half a mile. It was remarkably, and when I started training in medicine in the 1970s, this was still functioning as an asylum. And I remember one of the most frightening and shocking experiences of my life was to go and visit that hospital on the first occasion. It is important to note that the impetus that gave rise to the asylums did not come from psychiatry or even from medicine. According to the historians, it came from this social movement aimed at controlling unreason. However, once thousands of people had been excluded from society and brought together in these institutions, they gradually came more and more under the management of doctors. And when they were in these buildings, under the control and care, in inverted commas, of doctors, then the medical imagination came to bear on these people and their lives. It was in this environment that psychiatry was born. Roy Porter says, indeed, the rise of psychological medicine was more the consequence than the cause of the rise of the insane asylum. Psychiatry could flourish once, but not before large numbers of inmates were crowded into asylums. In some ways, I sometimes use the expression, those of you who understand the Christian world will be familiar with the notion of original sin. The idea that when a child is born, even though it has done nothing, it comes into the world already with sin that it has to deal with. And in some ways, psychiatry came into the world on the back of an act of social exclusion. So it had this, what I call original sin, already built in, quite different to the history of medicine. The very origins of psychiatry in these asylums has meant that it has continually struggled with this legacy. In addition, the Enlightenment was associated with massive scientific advances. With discoveries and advances in physics, chemistry, and biology, the idea that human life itself could and should be the subject of scientific analysis became prominent. The areas of science that we now take for granted, like psychology, sociology, linguistics, anthropology, all came into being in the post-Enlightenment world. And with this came the idea that all human problems would ultimately be open to scientific investigation and modeling, and that technological solutions and interventions to such problems could be designed and implemented. Textbooks of psychiatry are keen to assert the scientific nature of the psychiatric approach. In their oft-quoted book, in British Psychiatry, The Reality of Mental Illness, Defense of Psychiatry Against the Anti-Psychiatry Movement of the 70s and 80s, two very prominent British psychiatrists, Roth and Kroll, write, "The advance of science has helped societies in their thinking about aberrant behaviors to move from moralistic, theistic concepts to definable, naturalistic mechanisms that may ultimately be either alterable or acceptable as legitimate alternatives." Now, as well as this focus on rationality, reason, and science, the Enlightenment also gave rise to an increasing focus on the individual self. And this really, as I say, happened across the Western world. So we see in literature the rise of the novel, concern with looking at characters in stories rather than just the plot line being what people were interested in. We see it in plays and other forms of artistic endeavor. We see the concern with the individual also arising in the law and the notion of human rights emerging, that the individual citizen is not just a subject of the king or the queen or the state, but has rights in his or her regard. So all of these things come together. In this slide, I've tried to characterize how psychiatry is very much a product of these forces. My argument is that without the Enlightenment and that shift that happened culturally with the Enlightenment, there would be no psychiatry. We would have medicine. Medicine dates back to Greeks. Western medicine has its origins back then. But the discipline we call psychiatry only came into being in this more relatively recent period of time. On the one side, the focus on unreason gave rise to exclusion and confinement, and thus the unified subject matter for the new discipline to study, theorize, and to treat. It also gave rise to the idea that there could be a science of madness and distress, with experts, authorities, university departments, training programs, etc. And the focus on the individual self and the individual mind gave rise to different discourses. Ultimately, in the 19th century, we see the emergence of phenomenology in philosophy, and ultimately, I would argue that the key book of 20th century psychiatry, Karl Jasper's General Psychopathology, emerges, and Jaspers is using phenomenology from Edmund Husserl he invokes Husserl in his putting forward of this framework for thinking about psychiatry. And indeed, we also see this in the emergence of psychoanalysis. Freud is often presented in Hollywood movies and that as this great explorer of the interior mind, of going down deep into the human condition, in that very seeking out the truths of human life in the individual and the complexes within the individual's mind. My argument is that psychiatry is a product, as I say, of the Enlightenment. It is very much a modernist enterprise. Its values, its orientation, its assumptions, its relationships with its patients, its self-understanding, all come about from this history and cannot be understood without it. In the 20th century, these background assumptions and values did not go away. They simply became more refined and more powerful. In most countries, psychiatry has sought to continue its role in control and coercion. Psychiatry as a discipline has argued for its central role in controlling people under the law in most countries in the world. It continues to focus on the individual self, and it has come to be guided by what I called the technological paradigm. This is what I want to go on to look at now. I use the word paradigm in the Kuhnian sense of Thomas Kuhn and his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, as a set of guiding assumptions and examples that allows a scientific discourse to take place. The technological paradigm in mental health underscores not just the medical model in psychiatry, but many of the alternatives being argued for at present. So it's not just about the medical understanding of madness and distress that the technological approach underscores, but many of the other areas that have come to look at mental health have also been guided by ultimately a technological frame of mind and reference point. By the technological paradigm, we mean an approach to understanding experiences such as low mood, hearing voices, suicidality, self-harm, fearfulness, elation, that sees them primarily as technical problems that need fixing. This approach works with the following assumptions. Number one, the problem itself, the problem to be addressed, has to do with a faulty mechanism or process of some sort in the individual. So the idea is that the cause of depression, of thoughts of suicide, of hearing voices, etc., there will be some faulty mechanism to be identified. Either psychological mechanism or biological mechanism, but there's a mechanism in there. There's some process that can be identified through research that we can get our hands at. Secondly, that this process can be modeled in causal terms. In other words, you can model that process in the same way that you would model anything going on in the natural sciences. Like the development of cancer is caused by an alteration in certain cells, which then cause certain other processes to start, etc., and you can model the development of that disease. And so too in psychiatry is the assumption that the underlying faulty mechanism or process can be modeled in causal terms. And that is described in a way that is universal, that it works regardless of the context. So just as if I develop malaria, if I develop that in Bolivia or in Peru or in Indonesia or here in Denmark, there is the same process underlying the illness that I've got at. And you can model that and you can call it and you can name it, and it will be the same everywhere. It happens regardless of the context. The underlying process is not influenced by that. That is an assumption within psychiatric research, that if you identify the underlying mechanism or process involved in psychiatric illness, then that will work regardless of context. Thirdly, the technological, psychiatric interventions are instrumental. They have nothing to do with opinions, values, relationships, or priorities. Fundamentally, that we can measure the interventions that we use, whether they are psychological techniques, or drugs, or even social interventions, or service models. We can set them up in a way that is independent of our values or of our assumptions or whatever, and we can compare them and we can contrast them and we can see which one works and which one doesn't work, just as we do in the rest of medicine. So those are what I would argue are the fundamental assumptions working within the underlying paradigm that I've called the technological paradigm. The only question to be asked of technology is, does it work? And is it efficient? And is it cost effective? These are the questions that you can ask about it. I want you to listen to the following introduction to an article This is picked almost at random from the British Journal of Psychiatry, one of the most prominent journals of psychiatry in the world. This is from a paper by Suzanne Benyons and others published in 2008. I could have picked one of any of the articles in the British Journal of Psychiatry almost. And this paper is interesting because it's actually about the use of psychosocial interventions rather than drug treatments for patients who have a manic depressive or bipolar tendency. I want you to look at the language that's being used here. She says, or the authors say, bipolar disorder is a complex recurrent mood disorder, and its impact on everyday life can be devastating. Although pharmacological interventions remain the primary tool in its management, medicines cannot control all aspects and consequences of the disorder. Psychosocial interventions target issues untouched by pharmacological treatments, such as medication adherence, awareness and understanding of the disorder, early identification of prodromal symptoms, and coping skills. As I say, this paper, this quote, is from a paper that examines evidence as to whether alternatives to drug treatments are of use to patients. My concern is not the content or the conclusions of the paper, but the language that the authors are using and the assumptions behind that language. Such episodes and experiences are understood to be due to a disorder. Drug treatment is the primary tool used in its management. Psychosocial interventions are understood as discrete techniques that are to be targeted at certain behaviors. While the paper is actually about alternatives to drugs, the idiom is still very much technical. And this idiom shapes and structures our current discourse of mental health, not just in psychiatry, but in other disciplines like psychology and even social work as well. In psychiatry, we see the technological paradigm shaping what have arguably been our three central concerns, theoretically and research-wise, of the past 25 years. What has psychiatry really been grappling with? Number one, its classification systems. Huge effort, money, meetings, energy has gone into producing the DSM system or the ICD system of the World Health Organization. Secondly, there's been this huge search for causal mechanisms, causal processes underlying mental problems. Huge amounts of money, particularly in Ireland. Many of the university departments of psychiatry are focused on genetic research for some reason. It's attracted billions of dollars. Also on looking at neurotransmitters, etc., etc. The whole research trajectory has been focused on this. And thirdly, the application of what has been called evidence-based medicine approaches in terms of treatment strategies. I'm not going to go into it in depth here, but in many ways, if you think about it, the evidence-based medicine approach, or EBM, is the epitome or the essence of the technical approach. Because what you're doing in the evidence-based medicine approach involves a quest to identify the specific technical fix that is at work in any medical intervention. So the whole movement of evidence-based medicine is about finding the best technical fix for any particular condition or other. And that has come to dominate a lot of our thinking in mental health in terms of the treatments that we use. A key move of the technological approach is to push the non-technical, non-specific aspects of mental health care to the margins. The technological approach does not ignore questions of relationships, of values and meanings, but crucially, it regards them as secondary to the main stuff, which is the technical stuff. Okay? So you will sometimes find editorials in the medical journals about relationships between professionals and patients. You will sometimes come across a review article looking at the importance of meanings, etc. But 95%, even more than that, of the articles in journals like the British Journal of Psychiatry, the American Journal of Psychiatry, and most of the major journals of the profession are technical in nature. They're actually about looking at causative mechanisms, classification systems, or evidence-based treatments. And I think that's just a statement of fact. The other issues are at the edges. When you look at conference programs, again, of the discipline, you can go through them, and I've done this. You will find that 90% of the content of what is being discussed, what people go to meetings for, is to look at these technical issues in one way or another. The non-technical stuff, as I say, are not ignored. They're not gone completely, but they're secondary importance. So this is reflected in the differential priorities afforded to these issues in publications, research agendas, teaching and training, syllabi, service priorities. In other words, where we spend our money in terms of mental health. It is very evident in our journals, as I say, I've already talked about that. So this is the essence of the currently dominant paradigm. It guides not only our training, our research, and service agendas, but crucially, it gives us our identity as psychiatrists, as specialist experts in the field of mental health. I'm now going to argue that there are serious difficulties with this paradigm. And I believe ultimately that those list of problems, when I talked about a crisis in psychiatry at the start of this lecture, I believe all of those difficulties, different difficulties that they are, emerge and come from the problems with this paradigm. But first I want to say a few words about why this paradigm might still be dominant, why it's still there, why it's still across the world the dominant way of thinking about mental health. And there is no easy answer to this. But firstly, as I've already argued, psychiatry as a discipline is very much a product of the European Enlightenment and the belief that science and technology will provide the answers to all the problems that face us as human beings. In the post-Enlightenment world, humanity became the object as well as the subject of knowledge, and human problems were now the proper concern of scientists and technical experts of different sorts. Once it emerged, the central concern of the new discipline of psychiatry was to establish itself as a bona fide medical science. And this quest still drives a great deal of our efforts. So psychiatry still continues to struggle with its identity and continues to have this quest to get itself regarded as a bona fide medical science. While we now live in what we generally regard as postmodern times, and faith in the legacy of the Enlightenment is being more and more interrogated in many discourses, the modernist orientation still dominates in medical circles. So while things are changing, there is still a great deal of cultural support for the technological paradigm. Secondly, thinking about mental health problems as technical difficulties is attractive for many patients or service users. Sometimes it is a great relief to regard one's suffering as a thing, something almost separate from oneself, that you can bring to an expert to have it named and treated. As such, it is something that allows the sufferer to give up some responsibility at times, and to move into what we call the sick role for a period. And this is sometimes very helpful and can be important to a person. So it's not just from the profession that continues the technological paradigm. Many patients actually want this kind of way and believe in it, and it is actually helpful to them at times. Thirdly, the technical paradigm has obvious advantages for the practitioner, whether a doctor, a nurse, or a therapist. It allows him or her to adopt the position of expert. Whatever technical model is used, the person who is trained in the logic and the workings of that model will always have authority. They will be the ones to listen to. I don't know what it's like in Denmark, but whenever there is any media discussion of mental health issues in Ireland, it will always be an authority figure from psychiatry or psychology or some discipline. Sometimes they will bring a patient on, but it's only to complement the expertise of the person who can speak with authority, can use the language, can talk about the model and the treatments, the science. The patient is there as an adjunct to that kind of presentation. Fourth, one of the major supports for the ongoing dominance of the technological paradigm is the enormous wealth of the pharmaceutical industry. This industry has worked to extend a technicalized and medicalized way of thinking about problems to areas of life that previously wouldn't have been the concern of doctors, therapists, or other professionals. It has often supported conferences and meetings that are not directly related to the marketing of drugs. It's more about creation of the context in which a biological approach to mental health problems is promoted. For example, the industry gave a great deal of support in the United States to the development of the DSM. Now, that wasn't about any specific drug being marketed or promoted, but it was about an approach to mental health that the drug industry made the calculation. This will be useful to us. This will extend the markets for our drugs, so we will support it. For example, in 2003, a third of all the symposia at the American Psychiatric Association meeting in the United States was devoted to bipolar disorders. This is 2003. A third of all of the symposia at their major annual conference was devoted to one disorder, bipolar disorder. A remarkable concentration on one particular problem. But at the time, a number of drug companies were actively marketing drugs for bipolar disorder. One target of the drug companies in this regard is childhood. In the United States in recent years, there's been a remarkable expansion of diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and with it an expansion of prescribing for children. Books like this, which is about a bipolar bear, have been promoted and encouraged and distributed widely. These aim to promote the idea that it is normal to give children powerful psychotropic drugs. In 2007, 1.6 million children in the US were on a cocktail, not on one drug, but were on a cocktail of two or more psychotropic drugs. Many of them are on 4 or 5 drugs. This is a remarkable social phenomenon that we've seen. And it's of questionable, at least questionable benefit to the children and their families. But it has made millions, billions of dollars for the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical industry is now the second biggest industry on planet Earth after armaments. It's grown massively. It's a huge phenomenon. So it's not surprising that, and psychiatry is all branches of medicine have been touched by its influence, but psychiatry is the biggest recipient of pharmaceutical industry funding and endeavors in the last 20 years. I want to make a point here about the role of service user organizations within the currently dominant paradigm. While within this paradigm, there is a role for service user organizations and individual activists. This is really advisory only. Just as patient groups can be allies in the field of cardiology or endocrinology, they do not change the assumptions or the science of the discipline. They are there in a consultative role only, and their expertise from their own experience will always be secondary to that of the technical expertise of the professional. My argument is that the current paradigm is coming into question and being challenged from developments outside of the professional world, such as the rise of the user movement, but also from developments within psychiatry itself, such as the emergence of movements like critical psychiatry that I've been a part of in the United Kingdom. There are now over 130, 150 psychiatrists who are part of the critical psychiatry network, who are starting to look at these issues and critique this currently dominant paradigm from different angles. And the rise of the recovery movement. I'm a bit uncertain as to how this has panned out in Denmark, but this, certainly in the United States, in New Zealand, Australia, in Britain and Ireland, this is a big movement that is happening, and it's an emerging discourse about a different way of engaging with mental health issues. I welcome this crisis that we are now in the midst of, and the questioning that it has provoked. In this slide, I've tried to represent the current situation. As I say, at present we understand mental health as primarily a technical field. Other aspects of mental health are understood as marginal. That's what I've tried to get across in this. Essentially, the cultural, conceptual, and scientific revolution I am suggesting is happening involves a reversal in how we see the world of mental health. It involves a shift to a situation where the mental health field becomes orientated around a very different discourse. In this, we do not dump the drugs, our therapies, or our service models out the window, but we start to see them as secondary concerns. And crucially, we start to determine how we construct them and use them according to the insights and priorities that emerge from a primary discourse that focuses upon meanings, values, and relationships. I want to look briefly at why this shift might be happening, and I will then look at why we should support this, and then in the close of my talk, I will look at the implications for us as practitioners, and mainly I'm talking about the discipline of psychiatry, but I think some of it is relevant to others as well. So why is this shift starting to happen? Why is this revolution, this radical change starting to happen? Well, first, we do live in postmodern times. The economic order of the world is changing rapidly. The economic realities and cultural priorities of us as human beings have changed. While in medicine, we are still enthralled to science and technology, the postmodern world more generally is less deferential to technical expertise, more questioning, less secure in its traditional sources of knowledge. We see many groups who are seeking to put values back into our debates about social and personal problems. Even in the area of food production, we see the rise of the organic movement, the fair trade movement, which are essentially about putting values back into the way we produce food and consume it. Secondly, our understanding of technology itself is changing. We are beginning to get beyond an instrumental view. Instead, we are beginning to understand that we actually build values and priorities into technologies that we develop and promote. Think of the sort of cars that are built in the United States, for example, how big they are and how they incorporate certain values that are prevalent within American culture. In turn, the technologies that we use serve to control, open up, limit, and define whole areas of life. For example, the way in which teenagers communicate and form relationships has been significantly influenced by the development of mobile phone technology. The way my children now communicate with each other, form friendships, even start relationships and end relationships is of an order that I find hard to comprehend. But this has emerged around the technology, the mobile phone technology. What is important is the idea that technology is not something independent of meanings, values, and relationships. It is both shaped by these phenomena and in turn works to shape them. Thirdly, I won't go into it in detail here, but there are signs that the medical profession, including psychiatry, is to some extent gradually freeing itself from the embrace of the pharmaceutical industry. This is not a very good slide, I'm afraid, but it's just to show this was the cover of the British Medical Journal a few years back, where they really took on the influence of the pharmaceutical industry within medicine more generally. And more doctors are starting to think seriously about the importance of an academic culture that is genuinely independent of industry influence. There are, I would argue, a number of reasons why radical change involving a move beyond the technological paradigm is justified. Or major interventions in psychiatry, or the use of drugs and psychotherapy. The first kind of reason, the first set of arguments in favor of radical change are empirical, basically from the scientific discourse itself, from within that field. The evidence about the effectiveness of drugs and psychotherapy is becoming very clear. We usually assume that these interventions work by fixing some specific biological or psychological fault. However, there's accumulating empirical evidence that what we call the non-specific aspects of our interventions are in fact the most important. This is the case in regard to both pharmacological and psychotherapeutic interventions. Take depression, for example, one of our bread and butter conditions. Two widely reported meta-analyses of antidepressant drugs have demonstrated that most, I'm careful not to say all, but most of the therapeutic effect of antidepressant drugs is due to what we call the placebo phenomenon. How does the placebo effect work? Well, essentially we are looking at relationships and meanings. Similar evidence has emerged from the side of psychotherapy. There's a long discourse on how important non-specific aspects of psychotherapy are in producing therapeutic change. Several recent studies have shown that most of the specific features of cognitive behavioral therapy can be dispensed with without adversely affecting outcomes. A comprehensive review of studies of the different components of CBT concluded that there is, and I quote, little evidence that specific cognitive interventions significantly increase the effectiveness of the therapy. Don't get me wrong, psychotherapy works, but it doesn't seem to matter very much what model or what technology, what specific technology or techniques are used. What really matters in psychotherapy is the quality of the relationship between the patient and the therapist, whether the patient feels respected and valued, and whether the encounter ultimately is meaningful. So that these conclusions have emerged from using the tools of evidence-based medicine itself, the very epitome of the technological approach. Ironically, this is now throwing up evidence that challenges its own paradigm to the core. The second level of arguments is philosophical, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, even though we could spend a long time discussing this. But what is at stake here is the age-old question of what it is we deal with as psychiatrists. What part of human suffering is it our job to confront? Cardiologists deal with hearts, respiratory physicians deal with lungs, neurologists and neurosurgeons deal with the brain and the nervous system. Psychiatry deals with the mind, with mental illness. The problems we engage with in this world have to do with our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, our relationships. The philosophical question or the conceptual question is this: to what extent do problems in these areas of thoughts, feelings, relationships, and behaviors, to what extent do problems in these areas behave in the same way that problems with our lungs, our livers, and our brains behave? Can we analyze and research them in the same way? I'm not going to go over the arguments here, but I think there is a growing awareness among psychiatrists that there are some fundamental issues here. Hence the emergence of philosophy of psychiatry as an important academic development in recent years. This is a cover for the Oxford textbook of philosophy and psychiatry. There's been a major series of books published by Oxford University Press in the UK. There's an international organisation, International Society for Philosophy and Psychiatry. It's a growing area of concern and of serious academic work within psychiatry. Alongside an interest in philosophy, we also see an increasing interest in culture, anthropology, history, spirituality, and religion. What were marginal discourses are now playing an increasingly important role. The third level of arguments are political. What's at stake here is the social position of those people who experience episodes of mental illness. The question to be asked is, has the technological framing of states of madness and distress helped to promote social inclusion, acceptance, and combat stigma? Now, I believe that there have been developments that the lives of people with mental health problems are probably better now than they were 50 years ago. But for the most part, these developments have not come about through science, but through social and cultural change. Take an example from the field of learning disability. The case of Down syndrome. You're familiar with Down syndrome? Mongolism, it's also called. Now, geneticists identified the fact that this syndrome was caused by a chromosome 21 trisomy some 50 years ago. So the genetic cause of Down syndrome was identified and clearly identified more than 50 years ago. But in itself, this discovery did not bring any improvements in the lives of people with this disorder. I don't know what it's like in Denmark, but when I talked about the asylum in Cork in the 1970s, I was still seeing people with Down syndrome incarcerated in institutions like that. the improvements in the lives of people with learning disabilities has come about through the change in social attitudes towards disability and the resulting developments in social policy across many countries. The last 20 to 30 years has seen massive investment in biological research in psychiatry, but I would argue that very little of this research involving genetics, brain scans, and neurochemistry has contributed anything to the practical lives of patients and their families. I go to many meetings with service users, with patient groups and organizations. I have never heard a user organization call for more genetic research in schizophrenia as a priority. Never. And yet, that area of research has attracted billions of dollars of government and other funding, particularly in my own country, as I say, but in other countries as well. Indeed, there is striking evidence from work on stigma that the more we promote the idea that mental illness is due primarily to some sort of biological dysfunction, the less happy are members of the public to share social spaces with those who endure episodes of mental illness. This is very worrying, as a great deal of our current efforts around stigma are premised on exactly this idea. In other words, we're selling the public the idea that mental illness is just like any other illness. It's due to a biological disorder in the person's brain. That idea, when the public get hold of it, seems actually to make them more wary of people with mental health problems than less wary. So the actual effect, and there's empirical evidence from Germany over time to show that public campaigns around stigma along these lines have actually made the situation worse. Lastly, I've talked there ethical, and this is possibly the most important thing that I'm talking about. So far, I've looked at some of the reasons why a crisis is happening and why radical change is justified. However, to my mind, the most profound development in the field of mental health in recent years has been the rise of the service user movement. This is both a reason why a crisis is happening and a justification for us to work for radical change in how we understand and engage with mental health problems. Because if we say, and every country in the world is saying this, that we want to develop user-centered services, training and research programs, then it is simply unethical to carry on as if the user movement did not exist. And that is what's happening in very many places. Now, it's important to be clear. Many service users, as I've already said, are happy with the technical paradigm. They seek a diagnosis and a treatment and are happy to understand their problems in a medical or a psychotherapeutic idiom. However, a growing number of service users are seeking different ways of thinking about and working with mental health problems. This is evidenced in the emergence of groups such as the Hearing Voices Network, which is active here in Copenhagen. In UK, we have a self-harm network. We have even a paranoia network. The Evolving Minds group. Mind Freedom International, big international organization centered in the States. Mad Pride, growing movement in Ireland, in the States, in Ghana, in other countries. People who want to take back the whole world of madness from the professionals and say there are aspects of our world and our experiences that we actually want to celebrate, that we don't want to regard as illness. We want to define them differently outside of a psychopathological framework. These groups refuse the idea that their experiences can be adequately grasped in the language of psychopathology. This is very much the message of a group in America called the Icarus Project. They have been meeting, writing, and campaigning since 2002. And at the heart of the Icarus Project is an effort to redefine the meaning of bipolar experience. They say in their writing, we shared a vision of being bipolar that differs radically from the narrow model put forward by the medical establishment, and we wanted to create a space for people like us to articulate the way we understand ourselves, our disorder, and our place in the world. However, I've met the people from the Icarus Project, and they are not unrealistic. They know how destructive episodes of mania and depression can be. They are not dogmatic, and they're not against drugs or using drugs. Some of them use medications, but they do promote self-determination in relation to treatment decisions, including whether to take drugs or not, and whether to use diagnostic categories or not. Groups like Icarus are not anti-psychiatry, but they want a psychiatry that can think outside of the language of psychopathology and that can respect the expertise that they have gained through their personal and communal struggles. I want to end by looking at what this whole shift in movement might mean for us as practitioners. I speak as a psychiatrist. How would our discipline have to change to become part of this revolution? For me, this is about imagining a mental health practice that is able to think beyond the logic of the technological paradigm. What would a post-psychiatry look like? First of all, and emerging from what I've just said about the emerging user movement, we need to think differently about the nature of mental illness. We need to get beyond the traditional understanding of psychopathology. We need a medical discourse around mental health that is simply adequate to the job. What I am saying is that the current discourse is not. It is built on faulty philosophical, conceptual, and cultural assumptions, and it doesn't do the job that is asked for us. I am a doctor. I am passionate about the need for the involvement of doctors in the lives of people with mental health problems. I've yet to go to a service user organization where they say, we don't want doctors involved here. But they want a different kind of medical discourse, one that is not built on the idea that we have an expertise and you are the recipients and have to be the recipients of that expertise. And I think there are ideas from our history, in particular, and this is of interest to this particular group, I think, the phenomenological tradition within psychiatry and psychotherapy and psychology has very important things to teach us about how we might start to think differently about the nature of our experiences in the world and the nature of mental health experiences in the world and the relationship of those to our bodily position as well as our psychological position. From this, if we can get that kind of different theoretical and set of ideas, from this would flow a different way of thinking about the nature of expertise and what training should involve. And I believe that this will have less to do with learning about theories and models and more to do with encouraging skills in the non-specific aspects of mental health. Skills in being able to tolerate ambiguity and ambivalence. Skills with regard to negotiation around issues to do with framing and intervention. And I see a substantial role for collaboration with service user organizations in this training work. As it is now, certainly in the medical field, the doctors in training rarely meet with service users outside of the clinical encounter, in which they are the powerful one and the patient is the less powerful one. But they very rarely actually go and meet with service users and their organizations on a more equal level where they can learn from those organizations. There are implications for our research priorities. If we can get beyond the technological imperative, we might see the importance of research that prioritizes, again, collaboration between professionals and users. I won't go into details because I'm kind of over time now, but we can come back to some of these issues in our discussion. With regard to services, I think there are two very important insights that emerge from the recovery literature that is becoming important at the moment. First is the realization that recovery from mental health problems is often made by paths, by ways that are alternative to traditional routes such as medication or even psychotherapy. Research with service users indicates that things such as work, leisure, relationships, spirituality, creativity, friendship, sport, travel, acceptance are all of much greater importance in providing the context that allows people to move beyond the sense that their lives are stuck. So that's one big insight that's coming from the recovery in literature. It's telling us that actually what makes a difference for people is not the things we've been focusing on so much at all. It's all these other aspects of the person's life. Secondly, what emerges from that literature is that the loss of social position that goes with using mental health services for many people is profound. In fact, for some, just the fact that they have been a mental health service recipient becomes a greater problem than the problem that brought them to psychiatry in the first place. And this loss of social position is not something that can be overcome by service users themselves or even by professionals for that matter. And what this points to, what these insights point to, is the need to think about mental health services that are not just in the community, but that somehow involve our communities, the different organizations that are there, in our debates and in our discussions about mental health. And I would talk about this, as I say, we can talk about it more, but I would use the phrase a community development approach to mental health being an emerging source of importance. Okay, most importantly, the revolution that I'm talking about has profound implications for how we conceive our relationship with the service user movement. And I believe that this is about moving, as I say, from consultation to collaboration. I believe that there are real challenges in this agenda for us as psychiatrists, but I actually think there are some very positive things to be gained for psychiatry in this, if we can engage in it positively. The service user movement is not going to go away. In fact, it is growing from strength to strength. It's going to be over the next 20 years where the action is in mental health. I believe this is a cultural change that is profound. And I think psychiatry simply has to come to terms with that and learn how to engage and collaborate in a positive way. And I believe, in fact, that many psychiatrists are doing this in their practice, if not in their theories. They are already working with service user organizations like the Hearing Voices Network, etc., in some countries at least. I also see the pharmaceutical industry as fading. The profits to be made, they've actually saturated the market, and the market can take no more. And they're actually starting to disengage from mental health work. That's quite clear in some of the recent statements coming from CEOs of pharmaceutical companies. Mental health field is no longer the great untapped resource that they saw it as 20 years ago. They're now shifting to other priorities. Okay, just as the historical task for surgeons was to find a way of safely opening the body without killing the patient, and the task for pediatrics was to develop a form of medical understanding that recognized the major difference between the developing body and the adult body, so too the historical task for us is to develop a medical discourse that is adequate to the nature and reality of the problems we are tasked to deal with. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to engage in any questions that I can answer that comes from the floor. Thank you.
Hello. It was about what you said about the technological paradigm. I'm having a bit difficulties understanding what exactly the difference between the technological paradigm and a positivist approach is. And because the way that it's sort of like you point out with the Enlightenment, how it's a quest to map out the self and how to get to the bottom of the inner essential human being. The way that you sort of take the technological aspect or technology as such as a part of the positivist approach, I don't really think that you can pull apart those two things. And the way that it sounds to me when you talk about the nature of mental illness, the nature and reality of mental illness, that this technological paradigm is in fact actually the positivist approach. Do you see what I mean?
I do, yeah. and I agree that they're very much the same thing, really. I suppose I would use the term positivism in terms of research strategies within the technological paradigm. But I think the notion of positivism for me is a kind of research orientation, whereas on a kind of more, if I could use the philosophical term, ontological level, if you like, about what the nature of that reality is, that's where I use the term technological. But you're right. The two are more similar. There's no contradiction between. It's just a different use of words, I think, in terms of how we're describing the phenomenon. Sorry.
Okay.
Hello? Is that you can hear? Okay.
Yes.
But if I can just because then if I understand you correctly, then you can actually take positivism out of psychiatry. So it sounds like to me is what you're saying. If the technological paradigm is somewhat equal to the positivist approach, then you're saying you can somewhat take this approach out of psychiatry. Is that correctly understood?
I think you can create a different way of thinking about research.
Okay.
What I'm trying to get at is the idea that as it is now, we see the world of mental health through a technological idiom. So the problems show up as technical problems. Depression is a list of symptoms. We need a model of how those symptoms come about, and we need an intervention or treatments that we can measure and compare to see whether they work or not. So it shows up, that is the dominant kind of way of thinking. I think if we're able to step back from that and say that there actually is there is a prior world to that from which problems with depression emerge, a world of values, meanings, relationships, etc., out of which the symptoms or the problems emerge, and from which the solutions will also emerge. And that's the evidence is showing that that's where the real solutions that we can have a discourse about depression, which is focused on values, meanings, relationships, and we might well, at some point in that, want to look at biological aspects of distress. That might become an important thing to do. But we will do that out of this prior discourse that gives rise to the questions that are going to be asked, how we're going to ask those questions, what form the research will take place, how we will judge the answers and how we will use them. And that might involve quantitative aspects, but it will be guided by a different set of assumptions and priorities than the currently dominant way of looking at things. Whereas I think the positive approach to research assumes straight off that you can just engage with the psychological realm, with the realm of mental illness, using the tools of the natural sciences. That there isn't a problem, you just do it straight away. That's the positivist approach. I think post-positivism, or a questioning approach to that, will say that there is, there's that's a faulty move to make, and does violence, in fact, to the world of mental health by bringing in, technologies and techniques and an orientation that simply doesn't work. I don't know if I'm answering you very well, but I don't see a conflict between what you're calling the positivism, and I deliberately didn't use the word positivism in the lecture, even though I have used it in other places to describe some of what we're grappling with.
Okay, it was also just to say that I think that
I think we have to change
so just one thing, that the positivist discourse is prior to the technology. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Can I have the debate afterwards?
Yeah.
Please.
Okay. Yeah, at the end of your lecture, you talked about creating a new medical discourse about these problems called mental illness. This is one thing I wonder, why a medical discourse? Why couldn't it be another kind of discourse, philosophical, whatever, spiritual, whatever? And another thing I want to say is, you said that you've never met any kind of movement, user movement, who didn't want medical doctors in the field. Now you know that there was this moral treatment by the Quakers, and the Quakers did not have any medical doctors involved, and they had wonderful outcomes. So why do we need medical doctors involved? And also, if you look at other alternatives like open dialogue in Finland, medical doctors play a very, very marginal role there, and they have excellent outcomes.
I agree. I agree. I agree that it will be a more marginal role, certainly a less central role. At the moment, the doctor, the psychiatrist, is at the center of our response to mental illness, the official response across many countries. And that is often enshrined in legislation. Certainly in Ireland, in Britain, I don't know what it's like in Denmark under mental health law, but in Ireland it is very clear that the law makes it that the psychiatrist shall have the determining role in whether someone is incarcerated, someone is released, what treatment, what interventions, what decisions will be made, etc. And I'm very clear. I have an article in this month's Irish Journal of Psychiatry, of Irish Journal of Psychological Medicine, arguing that that should not be the case, that the doctor, we do not have the knowledge to justify that, and even if we did have superb knowledge, the recovery approach that we in Ireland are seeking to put forward would make a much smaller role for medical people than is the case. So I have no argument on the idea that the role for medics has to be much more marginal, but I am still, I still believe that there is a role, that what I am articulating is not anti-medical. It is not saying there is no role for medicine in this area, and in that I would be, I've debated with Thomas Sands from New York, who argues there is no role for medicine here at all, and it's a completely wrong territory for doctors to intervene. And I've debated with him on this because I think that this is right medicine, that's wrong area for medicine. I think that what I call binary thinking isn't adequate to the complexity of the lived reality of mental illness, which sometimes does involve bodily issues of one sort or another. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question. And with regard to the Quakers, I have a lot of respect for that tradition of the retreat, the York retreat, but they did employ a doctor simply because they felt they had to, because they were competing with the other madhouses that all were run by doctors. So they felt they had to employ a doctor. And he started, when you read the history, they looked for a doctor who would actually listen to what the Tuke family who set up the retreat would tell him. And when he started, he used all the medical techniques that were available, spinning chairs, putting people into cold baths, all the other medical techniques that were there. Over time, because he had the ability to listen and to genuinely observe, he came to the conclusion that none of those techniques had anything to offer people. But he was still a doctor involved, and but his role became less and less and less over time.
Well, it's actually a continuation on that one. I was thinking about that the user organisations have tended to because of the abuse in psychiatry, to reject psychiatry very much. But I'm curious to hear what kind of role, more specific, would you envision that psychiatry can come with? I mean, I agree that it can come with if you become ill, as in physically ill. But I was thinking, what kind of role, or perhaps there is not much of a role. I don't know. Do you know what I'm asking about?
I am. I do. There's a number of levels. I think that there is a role, and I agree that first of all, I think it would be I would be very clear that I think it's a much smaller role, a much less dominant role, a much more negotiated role than is the case now. So I'm not in any way, my whole lecture, my whole talk is about critiquing the current position. So it's arguing for something different. But I still am making the case that there is a role for a different medical discourse. Because lots of people come with problems around sleep, problems around body of one sort or another, problems that feeling overwhelmed and wanting to take some medication or something that helps at those particular periods of being overwhelmed. And I do think there is a role for that and to negotiate that with people. So if people are using medicines, then we need to know how those work, what the side effects are, etc. And you need some kind of medical place there. Also, just in terms of the job of deconstructing the current way of looking at things, there is a role for doctors in that, and opening up different ways of looking at things. So it's a territory to be mapped, but I'm not making the case that it's we replace one kind of medical expertise and knowledge and dominance with another form of medical expertise and dominance. I'm talking a much more restricted, more negotiated involvement of a medical discourse in the field of mental illness. But I do reject the idea that you can almost you can make a ruling, as Thomas Saz does, almost kind of like a law, that there should be no doctors involved in this field at all, and it's completely illegitimate to be involved. Because I think for many patients, that makes them feel uncomfortable then, if they are seeing a doctor and negotiating things around medication, around something to help them sleep or help them to negotiate a difficult time in their lives, etc. So I don't know if that answers.
No. I was thinking the one, because I was thinking if it's like psychology could take one role of the sort of the bedside, hand holding. But you're thinking much more specifically just of a small area of medication, of course, removing the forced medication.
Also, in terms of just what I would say, sometimes I did a period of my own training in the world of what's called neuropsychiatry. It's a specialized area that looks at the direct interface between psychiatry and neurology. And I was working at a centre in Birmingham in the UK that dealt with complex forms of epilepsy. Okay? And so I was the psychiatrist at the meetings where we were discussing because this was a specialist referral centre, kind of tertiary referral centre for people who had various epileptic syndromes and problems, etc. And so we would be meeting with the neurologists and the neurosurgeons and the brain scanning people and all of them. And what was interesting was when I went there, I thought, I'm going to have to be a really super duper, know the brain kind of, I'll have to really study my neuroanatomy and my neurophysiology and all of the rest of it. And in fact, they didn't want that at all. They wanted a doctor who knew the medical discourse around epilepsy, but who was able to negotiate easily in the territory of relationships. And have time sometimes to be able to spend with families, etc., negotiating with. So there are areas, whether we like it or not, where that whole world of whether we call it bodily disturbance or brain disturbance and psychological, that split breaks down. And I believe that there is a genuine need for people with medical knowledge and understanding, but crucially, who don't come at it, who can come to that territory with a different orientation about the phenomena that they're dealing with. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And I think that's another aspect of it,
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, you've moved a bit onto the subject. I'm wondering more about in terms of research strategies and now how to bridge, or if you have any thoughts on how to bridge the gap between the positivist research strategy and the more social and psychological views in terms of researching the phenomena, because I believe there are measurable things happening in the brain in context of mental illness, and if you have any thoughts on how to link those fields of research.
Well, it's a very wide subject and a very good question. It's a big one. But what I ended on there was the idea, and that I would particularly kind of promote, is the idea of collaborative research between service users and academics and practitioners, because you can start to develop a very different understanding of mental health and mental health interventions if you go at it from that kind of collaborative point of view. I was talking with Anders last night about in London, there's a group now called the Service User Research Enterprise, or SURE. It's based in the Institute of Psychiatry, which is a biggest psychiatric kind of research and theoretical kind of institution in the UK. But the Service User Research Enterprise there has played a very important role in bringing a very important understanding of how the way you do research with service users will often determine the answers that you get. And for example, and one that's very important, is with regard to ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. About 10 years ago, the British government embarked, because of issues coming up from service user organisations, complaints about ECT. The British government commissioned 2 big pieces of research about the ECT. One, they got the usual academics to look at the medical literature, but they also commissioned this organisation called SURE to look at that research, plus to look at evidence from service user organisations about their experience of ECT and what they had written about it. And they did a very, very nice piece of work that brought out very clearly that in terms of judging whether ECT works for patients or not, how you do the research is very important. So if the research is carried out by the doctor who's given the treatment in the hospital while the patient is still there, and according to a research set of questions that the doctor has made up, they will usually get a very positive response to the questions about the usefulness of ECT. And those things then get entered into the published literature, and that becomes the scientific understanding of the effectiveness of ECT. What the service users showed is that if you wait until the patient goes home, they're in their own house, they've got out of the hospital. 2, it's not their doctor or their nurse who comes to do the research, but an independent person. And 3, if the form of the research is of a more negotiated quality rather than according to questions that's been made up by the researcher, you get a much different account of ECT. And what's important about that is that that research has now entered the literature and can be quoted in terms of debates about the usefulness of ECT. So, and what was important is that 2 of the service users on that research had ECT themselves. So they were very familiar with the issues of power and the issues of representation, the issues of context that go with that treatment. So when I talk about kind of moving towards a different research agenda, I could see all sorts of ways in which that kind of collaboration between academic researchers and service users might come up with a very kind of different answers to some of the questions we're interested in.
But still in this, you're centered on the symptoms and the illness itself. Do you have any idea how to maybe make a different way of studying the way the symptoms come about? For example, how do you begin to hear the voices if you hear voices, or how did the symptoms come about? Do you have any idea how, or is there an idea on how to study that?
I've been a psychiatrist for 30 years, about 30 years, and I've worked in different places in Ireland. I've worked in the United Kingdom, in cities, in rural areas. I've worked in Africa, and I've talked with people who hear voices all over the place. And they're all completely different. Genuinely. You sit down with someone who tells you they're hearing voices, never the same experience for one person than for the rest. So I'm very wary of the idea that you can even talk about how do voices come about. Do you know what I mean? It's like saying, how do we learn to play sport? Well, you know, that's almost a nonsensical question, because what is sport? You know, it'll be done differently in different ways. Different societies will have different ways of thinking about sport and encouraging people. Sometimes people will come to play sport in their late 50s for medical reasons. Other times it comes from just their interest as a child, etc. So there's so many different ways, you know. The idea that there is one way that people will develop voices, I think is a wrong starting point. And what we need to do, in some ways echoing what I'm saying there, is that if we can start not with the experience of voices, but the context, you know, to understand the context, which ultimately the experience will be given meaning by. Because no experience has meaning outside of a particular context. Do you know what I mean? And hearing voices is a very good example, because in some cultures, as you know, hearing voices is a valued experience. It's seen as a bridge to a spiritual dimension. So it will be something that's encouraged. So if a child reports that they are hearing voices, the parents may well say, very good, who are you hearing? That's excellent, etc. In another culture, it might be seen as, don't talk about that, it's a disaster, you know. And so the origins of voices, how they become part of someone's life, and how the person deals with them or doesn't deal with them, is a much more complex idea than simply looking at a scan and trying to understand it. You know what I mean? You have to start from a very different place.
Just a question, since I think many people here are psychologists. Would you have any thoughts about the potential roles of psychiatrists and psychologists in the development of a new paradigm, and the interaction between them from a medical perspective or from a psychiatrist perspective?
Yeah, I'm aware that probably most of you are psychologists, and I think there is an issue for psychology, because I think, and one of the themes that I've tried to bring out is the idea that the technological paradigm, or the positivist paradigm, is not just dominant in psychiatry, but is actually dominant in psychology as well, I think. And I believe that there is a need for psychology to engage also in a kind of a critical understanding of how some of its theories and its orientations, its priorities, its relationships have come about. So, I mean, I think it is important that critical discourse is nourished and developed within psychology as well as in psychiatry. There's perhaps and even with regard to therapy, I think, again, there is a literature on how some people are harmed by psychotherapeutic interventions that is not acknowledged enough, I think, but I certainly meet a lot of people who feel that the way their problems were talked about and handled, and that led to a deepening of the problem rather than a helping of the problem, so to speak. So I don't see it as just psychiatry and psychology as you know, but there's definitely ways in which psychology can be part of a transformation in the discourse around mental health, and there are some very, very positive people working in that area. In the UK, I would have a lot of time for people like Richard Bentel and others who've kind of, you know, really brought a different way of looking at the whole area of psychosis and that, even though I would differ, because I think Richard is much more cognitivist in his thinking than I would agree with, but we can at least have a conversation, and we would regard each other, I think, as friends in these debates. So I'm not answering your question very well. But all I can say is that I think there is a very positive role for a psychology that has developed its own critical faculty and that it just doesn't see psychology as the good guy and psychiatry as the bad guy. I think psychology needs to be more sophisticated in its approach to these debates than that kind of simple approach. So I hope I'm not offending people in that debate.
I guess traditionally there's been a bit of a power differential between psychologists and psychiatrists.
Yes.
And if psychiatrists move out of a technological paradigm, that could shift relationships between the two professions.
It could, yeah. In the end, though, the people I want to see becoming more powerful, more articulate, and having more central role are service users, and we all need to create the spaces in which that can happen. I think if psychiatry has a diminished role, then it is important that psychology doesn't jump to occupy that space of expertise. And this is one of the things I have debated with Richard Bentel, is the idea that there is a cognitive approach to hearing voices that is, the answer. I'm not saying that Richard is saying that, but I think, there are perhaps some people who would put that forward. I think we need to clear a space where there is a very different kind of discourse that emerges around experiences like hearing voices, for example.